All right, excellent. So welcome everybody. Good to see all of you, or so to speak. And we're excited to do another round of presentation on Executive Order 594. I want to start by apologizing in advance in case my dog starts barking. I'm the only one in the house, and so I'm responsible for her well-being as well as presenting to all of you. So hopefully I will be quick and get through this, and then I can sneak off stage here and not have to worry about that. All right, so let's jump in. Executive Order 594 called Leading by Example, Decarbonizing and Minimizing Environmental Impacts of State Government. And that is what we're here to talk about today. So Ryan, jump to the next one. Very quickly, for those of you who've been around for some or all of the long and winding road, you will know that there have been 3 executive orders over the last 20 years that have increasingly become more proactive and more aggressive in terms of the standards and directives it is setting for our leading by example efforts. Orders in 2001, 2007, and now in 2021 have all built on each other, and I think have learned from each other in developing the standards and goals that we will be talking about here today. Let's go to the next one. So we wanted to set the context quickly before we jump into the order itself, and just remind folks that there are broader statewide efforts underway now as we speak to decarbonize and achieve net zero emissions across the entire Commonwealth, so economy-wide, reaching some of these aggressive goals. In the roadmap, the decarbonization roadmap that has been developed by Massachusetts, there are 4 key pillars that are essentially driving the process toward decarbonization. The 2 on the left, end use energy, so how do we transition away from fossil fuels in our buildings, our vehicles, and any other end uses where fossil fuels are consumed, is a key pillar. And then also looking at energy efficiency. How do we reduce the energy that we use in our buildings, in our vehicles, and how do we also enhance the flexibility of those assets to make sure that both our individual properties, individual vehicles, as well as the grid as a whole is operating cost effectively. Those are the 2 areas where this executive order focuses. And we will start talking about what that focus looks like in just a moment. The other 2 pillars, important to notice them and to note them. One is really looking at decarbonization of the energy supply, particularly around the grid and the zero and low carbon fuels and power necessary to provide electricity to our entire state, as well as some other zero and low carbon fuels that we will hopefully be relying on where electricity is not sufficient to power a particular end use. And then of course, last but not least, and still to be determined and still to be figured out how we calculate this, is looking at carbon sequestration, offsets. How do we balance whatever emissions we cannot remove from our system through these other pillars will need to be reduced through carbon sequestration, removing carbon from the atmosphere. So let's move on to the next one. So one more context slide here. We just want to remind folks why this order focuses very heavily on the emissions coming directly from fossil fuels that are consumed by our state facilities and by our state fleets. When we've gone back and looked at the data, it became very clear that while we saw some pretty significant and substantial progress in emissions reductions in our state portfolio, the vast majority, or 3/4 of those emissions, were attributable directly to the change in emissions intensity of the grid, meaning that through no action of our own, we were able to reduce our emissions at state facilities 75% because the grid was just getting cleaner every year through elimination of coal, elimination of oil plants, going to natural gas power plants, as well as an increase in renewables on the grid. We know that those emissions are going to continue to decline as offshore wind, which some of you may have heard was just approved by the federal government yesterday, I believe, or maybe the day before, So the first offshore wind project is likely to come online within the next 2 years. That and other projects of its kind will continue to lead to a dramatic reduction in emissions coming from electricity. So our focus on fossil fuel emissions is really about getting our own house in order. How do we address the emissions that we are directly responsible for and constitute the majority of emissions at our portfolio and will constitute a growing majority of our emissions moving forward. Next slide. So we also just want to recognize that in setting the goals and the targets that you'll see here in the executive order, we were very cognizant of the challenges before us in terms of what the state portfolio looks like. So when we look at greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings, we recognize that many of our facilities are large, millions of square feet at a single campus, for example. Many of our college campuses, health and human service campuses, many hundreds of thousands or millions of square feet. Many of these facilities have multiple buildings, all of which are from different ages, different sizes, different configurations. And many of these facilities are powered by central power plants that have lengthy and complex distribution systems, whether it's a hot water system or high pressure steam system. Many of them are 24/7 operations. And I think it's important to note that DCAM, working with many facilities around the Commonwealth, as well as other agencies working on their own, have been able to install a lot of newer equipment, newer HVAC equipment at our facilities, meaning that it's not likely that those pieces of equipment are going to reach the end of their useful life anytime soon. So all of these things taken together, when we look at the technical feasibility of replacing fossil fuels, as well as the cost effectiveness of and the timing of replacing fossil fuels, points to a strategy that creates a planning horizon over the next several years to then start deploying and implementing some of those strategies as we move into the late 2020s and 2030s. And you'll see when we talk about the goals, you'll see this kind of ramp up over time. And when we get into the 2030s, that there's a dramatic ramp up of emissions reductions targets. And this is exactly why. Similarly, when we talk about zero emission vehicles, we are talking about a fleet that is comprised primarily of pickup trucks and vans. As many of you know, zero emission vehicles in those categories are not yet available. And we also have to recognize that our fleets turn over at a relatively lengthy time frame, at least 7 years, perhaps even more for many of our vehicles. And so that means that vehicles that we are buying this year that are not available as a ZEV could very well be still in operation when we get to 2029, 2030, 2031. And so that points to, again, a kind of slow ramp up of these vehicles, while recognizing that we still need to acquire zero emission vehicles as quickly as we can. We also understand that it's going to be difficult over the next several years, which then kind of locks us into a fleet of primarily combustion vehicles over the next decade or so. And then lastly, I think we all recognize that the planning horizon, when we're looking at budgets or capital planning or master planning, is a long-term horizon for state projects. Capital budgets are in multi-year. We'll have to do 5-year capital plans. And as many of you know, it takes many years to create approvals for a project, design a project, do the studies necessary, and then actually go out to bid and then do the work. So we're talking about, even if we started to decarbonize at many of our facilities starting tomorrow or next year, it would be many years before we would actually be able to deploy decarbonized technologies at those facilities. And we also know that it's not feasible to be doing all of that kind of planning at all of our facilities simultaneously. So this is really just to set the stage for how and why we recognize the challenges associated with meeting the goals that are set here in this order. Next slide. So the order itself was signed on Earth Day, appropriately so, 2021, April 22nd. The effective date of the order, as you can see, is July 1st, coming up soon. There are other dates in there that are different from that, and we'll certainly go over those in a moment. But in essence, the order takes effect as of this July, and it does in fact supersede all of the provisions and requirements in the previous Executive Order 44. There's lots of sections in here, but the key ones we want to point out to you are, there's a section on both interim and long-term targets. There's a section that highlights and goes over detailed new construction standards. There's an existing building section that helps target and set the stage for decarbonization of existing buildings. There's a section on vehicles and fleet electrification. And then there's a section that talks about a number of other sort of non-directly climate-related directives and priorities that are important for us to keep in mind, but don't have specific targets associated with them. Next slide. So we're going to be going over in detail in a moment. I'm going to turn it back over to other team members at the Leading by Example program. Katie, Chelsea, and Ryan will walk through a lot of the details here. But I do want to just point out that as we are talking about the order, these are some of the key things to remember as to what this order is trying to accomplish. So, and I'll quickly run through these. So focusing specifically on fossil fuel emissions, that's a big one. That's throughout the executive order. The order is absolutely targeting the adoption of electric vehicles, and we do this through two matters, through fleet targets as well as annual acquisition requirements that kind of ramp up by vehicle weight. The new standard sets the stage for significantly energy efficient new construction, and that moves well beyond the current standard that we have, and Katie's going to talk about some of those details. As I mentioned, focusing on decarbonization in existing buildings. There's a provision in here that requires agencies to ensure that emissions reduction strategies and efforts are built into any long-term planning, whether it's capital budget planning or master planning or equipment replacement planning, that the emissions impact of those efforts are integrated into those other long-term planning efforts. There are, in fact, a couple of biofuel requirements in here for heating fuel and for vehicle fuel. And the order really does try to get at the deployment of innovative and new ways of approaching renewable energy, energy storage, resilience planning, making sure that in addition to the mitigation strategies that we are talking about and decarbonizing of fuels, we are also looking at these other ways to make sure that our facilities will support this transition to electrification, and that we will also be able to withstand the changes in the climate that we are sure to be facing in the years to come. And then last but not least, the order does specifically point out, and I think just by its very nature, is supporting the adoption of innovative technologies and innovative strategies that really are going to be necessary to support the goals in the order, as well as the statewide goals that have been set by this administration. That's next. So key differences between 44 and 594. We've gone through these, I think, to some degree, but I'll just reiterate them here. 44 essentially ended in 2020. The new executive order now has interim targets for 2025 and 2030, and some additional targets through 2050, 2040 and 2050. As I said, this order focuses on fossil fuel emissions as opposed to looking at our overall emissions, although we still will continue to track electricity and to understand what the emissions are from electricity use. There's a new construction standard that goes beyond the LEED certification plus 20% better than code, and Katie again is going to talk about that. And then again, an entirely new section on zero emission vehicles and other fleet requirements. There was in fact no section in Executive Order 44 on vehicles, so it just goes to show how much has changed since the promulgation of that order almost 15 years ago. Next. So who's covered? Anybody in the executive branch is covered. Anybody in public institutions of higher education, our 29 college campuses, is covered. And then the executive branch is defined further here by referencing different offices, boards, commissions, divisions, et cetera, that fall within the executive branch. I will add that the order specifically in the vehicle section or section 5, it does specifically reference the MBTA and the non-revenue vehicles as falling under the jurisdiction of the order in this particular section. I will say, for those of you who do not fall under any of those categories, we certainly will be reaching out to you and offering opportunities to voluntarily participate in the order, either voluntarily or in a more formal way. So more to come on that. As I reach sort of the end of my introductory piece here, I want to just point out that we are aware that funding is a big question for many of you. We understand that it is challenging and that it may be difficult. And so we understand that some of these strategies may be costly. They may cost more upfront. We understand that there's going to be a need to look into creative financing strategies, and that is something that we commit to doing with our partners at DCAM and elsewhere, and all of you. We also want to acknowledge that there's not going to be one single financing solution that is going to be the magic bullet. No one's going to hand us $1 billion and say, here you go, decarbonize the state. And so the solutions will have to be many, and we will have to ensure that we are identifying and utilizing solutions sometimes in combination with each other. We do plan to sort of release more information on this as we gather it, as we think creatively about this, but we do want to just quickly point out that as we think about financing, it's important to think about what is the total cost of ownership and the incremental costs associated with the decarbonization, the efforts that we will be undertaking, and not just look at the total investment. So that's a sort of new way of thinking about things. We also want to make sure that we are taking advantage of every single existing incentive programs out there, and there are many. And there are future incentive programs that are either being planned now as we speak or are likely to come into place at some time in the future. We also want to point out that the more planning we do in advance, and the more we think about the future and we think about when equipment needs to be replaced, how can we best use existing dollars, maintenance dollars, for example, to plan ahead for future decarbonization, the better and more cost-effective those decarbonizations will become in later years. We'd like to acknowledge that we have both seen and will likely continue to see declining technology costs, whether it's battery storage or solar modules, and that will continue to make a lot of our efforts more cost-effective. And that there are a lot of financing models that are being piloted and tried out there, and those are models that we plan to continue to look into and to bring here to Massachusetts to investigate and see what makes sense for us. Next. The next one. So very quickly, here's the chart of the executive order targets. You can see from the top 2 rows there, the emissions reductions targets and the % of the state fleet that must consist of zero emission vehicles go out all the way to 2050. And you will also see that, as I pointed out earlier, that we will start seeing significant ramp up as we get toward the end of this decade and into the 2030s. And that is when a lot of the planning efforts will begin to take hold, and we will start to see that transition over to non-fossil fuel options. And then there's some other goals here, which I'm not going to go over in a lot of detail because we'll talk about many of them in a moment, but goals related to fuel oil consumption, really trying to move away finally and completely from fuel oil as best we can, continuing to improve energy efficiency, and then also more than doubling the number of charging stations at state facilities by the end of this decade. Next. So just lastly for me, these targets that I just mentioned or just showed you, they apply to the entire state portfolio as a whole, and we will be calculating them as such. However, we will also be calculating those targets for individual agencies as we have done in the past, just to help agencies understand their own progress in the context of the order. And as I've mentioned, we will be continuing to track overall emissions as we think about them in the context of overall state goals, but that electricity consumption will not be part of the specific portfolio level tracking that we do in conjunction with this order. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Katie to walk us through section 3 on new construction.
Great, thanks, Eric. So Ryan, you can go ahead to the next slide. So starting on July 1st, all new construction and substantial renovation projects over 20,000 square feet that are either built for state use or are built on state land have to be built to the Massachusetts LEED Plus 2.0 standard, which is a revised iteration of the previous Mass LEED Plus standard that has guided state construction since around 2006. The definition of what constitutes substantial renovation will be outlined in an accompanying guideline that we're working on right now, but essentially encompasses projects that involve full HVAC systems, building envelope, and interior rehabilitation. The 2.0 standard requires all projects to primarily obtain LEED certification, as the name might imply, at the silver level or higher. And although LEED certification is nothing new, part of the premise of continuing this as a key component of the building standard for state construction is to incorporate many of the non-energy categories of LEED, such as chemical source reduction, water conservation, and recycling. The second sort of new and improved area of this standard is a performance 20% better than the existing energy code. And I think that is something that a lot of projects, particularly those under DCAM's purview, have been really great about achieving to date. And as part of that 2021 Massachusetts Climate Bill, DWR will be promulgating a specialized stretch energy code. Typically, it's a municipal opt-in code, and state government is normally exempt from those requirements. But part of this executive order is that within 6 months of promulgation of that code, that will replace this 20% over energy code requirement in the new construction standard. The next 3 bullets that you see bolded here, we wanted to just specifically highlight because I think they kind of encapsulate some of the key changes to the construction standard. As part of the energy performance approach, the standard dictates that projects need to prioritize specific strategies to improve efficiency, those being building envelope, air filtration, ventilation heat recovery, and reduce solar heat gains. So very similar to some of the passive house concepts. Use only efficient electric or renewable thermal technologies for heating, cooling, and water heating. And I think this speaks to a lot of the decarbonization goals that Eric alluded to earlier, both at the statewide level and within sort of the fossil fuel emissions construct of this executive order. But I think, again, sort of getting these systems in place now, knowing that they're going to serve sites for years to come, and also reducing on-site combustion of fossil fuels whenever possible. There is going to be an exemption process sort of outlined in the guideline that we are working on with DCAM, but do anticipate that for new construction projects, a lot of these requirements will be a lot easier to achieve than they typically are in existing buildings. And lastly, following a design that utilizes a best-in-class EUR target for similar buildings types in similar climate zones. Having a clearly defined and aggressive EUI target in the beginning really helps ensure that the end result is sort of getting at the type of performance that we hope to see from these new buildings. Next slide. One of the next requirements here is to maximize on-site renewables. I think that's obviously the preferable approach, but if not possible, at least design the building to be solar ready. And that's defined through the energy code, but it includes things like getting the electrical system prepared to handle it, designing the roof such that the roof can support and then has the right layout for solar in the future. So we'll be providing some additional guidance on that as well. Incorporating long-term climate resiliency into design and siting decisions. I think this includes resilience from the perspective of the physical infrastructure and not, for example, putting your battery in the basement when you are in a flood zone, but also energy resilience for expected climate change mitigation. So thinking holistically about, things like renewables plus storage and being able to island in case of a grid outage and things like that. And lastly, installing a minimum number of EV charging stations and setting up additional parking spaces to be EV ready. That aligns with the fleet electrification and charging station goals that Chelsea will speak to shortly. And there are thresholds laid out in the order that state parking lots under 25 spaces, they have to install at least 1 EV charging plug. For larger lots, at least 2 are required. And then for most lots, there will be the additional pre-wiring requirement. And that involves, trenching and preparing spaces up to the stub for further charging station installation in the future. We do expect increased fleet, workplace, and even public charging in the future to be very much in demand. And this is also a great cost reduction strategy because while you're tearing up the parking lot, you can kind of get everything ready to go rather than having to do that, 5 or 10 years down the line when charging stations are suddenly in demand. And lastly, there are sort of these optional but strongly encouraged not requirements, but components of the standard. Energy storage being paired with on-site renewables whenever possible. I think, to the site, there are definite values from incorporating energy storage, such as reducing demand charges and potentially increasing resilience. But it's also a great grid balancing strategy as well. As our grid becomes more and more based on renewable sources, that also increases the amount of intermittency that is possible. So, being able to offset and discharge batteries is going to be a really important asset to the grid and the state in the future. And part of transformative change in our transportation sector is enabling alternative modes of transportation. So prioritizing sites that make it easy for folks to walk or bike to work, are near public transit, those should all be sort of incorporated into the decision-making process. And lastly, part of this order also gives us the wherewithal to conduct a study or put one out for proposal that will look at embodied carbon as one of the strategies, sort of getting at the carbon sequestration piece. But given that there's already been some great research in this area as far as building materials, this should be something incorporated into the construction process whenever possible. So Ren, if you could go to the next slide. I'm going to be talking about existing buildings. If you can go to the next one. So agencies and campuses will be required to take these order targets into account when they're planning for designing and deploying projects that affect energy use. And I think that is very broad on purpose because we don't necessarily know what types of projects or technologies are coming, but if it touches on energy at all, these are sort of the things that folks should be cognizant of. The first is substantial reduction or elimination of on-site fossil fuels. As this is one of the primary targets of the executive order, it's also key for state government operations to do its part in reducing statewide emissions. Second is optimize building performance, and that can be through efficient operations as well as regular monitoring of building energy performance. Third, installation of the highest efficiency equipment and not, simply replacing like for like. This may mean more concerted efforts to identify and plan for end-of-life replacements, kind of reinforcing what Eric talked about earlier. We want to make sure that at every point in the decision-making process, the emissions and the targets and sort of the overarching goal of this order are all incorporated. Participation in all available energy efficiency and clean energy incentive programs. And lastly, incorporation of energy performance into leasing decisions. The state has several million square feet of lease space, so we want to incorporate elements of the executive order whenever possible in those instances. Next slide. So in addition, and a key element of the existing building requirements, the order requires existing state facilities to incorporate things like emission reduction, energy efficiency, renewable energy into capital master planning and equipment replacement planning. So by prioritizing emission reduction strategies as a key component in those planning efforts, and even in schedules starting now, I think decarbonization is expected to be more cost effective in the long term. I think as we've done a number of decarbonization studies at various campuses in the Commonwealth, kind of the overarching theme, if you will, is that yes, you can spend money to maintain and repair your existing systems, but over time, sort of the total benefit of ownership when you do transition to a decarbonized system is actually going to be less ominous, if you will, or hard to deal with because it just seems so monumental, but really the smaller things that you can do now to sort of pave the way for a future decarbonized system are really going to pay dividends. And for renovation projects that don't qualify as substantial that would then be subject to that new construction standard, have to include efforts such as transitioning to lower zero carbon fuels and conducting envelope upgrades, basically anything to help sort of get at the same objectives as the new construction standard when possible. The order sets requirements for tracking energy performance, including expanding CEI and identifying opportunities for operational efficiencies. And finally, again, given the amount of lease space, there are criteria outlined in the executive order that align with sort of the overall executive order itself. So that is buildings. And next, we're going to chat briefly about biofuels. If you could go to the next slide. So an area of focus in the order that cross-cuts buildings and vehicles, which will be our next section, is a set of new minimum biofuel blend requirements that go into effect on July 1st. So quickly approaching. For building heating oil, which does not include generators, there must be a minimum of 10% biofuels. And for diesel purchased and intended for state vehicles and other equipment when possible, there is a minimum 5% biodiesel requirement. Additional guidance about these requirements is hopefully going to be issued in the coming months, but just wanted to make folks aware of this timeline and sort of the minimum requirements. I think we've done a lot of groundwork with some of the state sites that have heavy heating oil or biodiesel use, just kind of helping prepare for this transition. But again, I think it's important to highlight as it's one of the key areas of this order. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chelsea.
Great, Katie, thanks. So on to section 5 of the EO, which outlines the requirements and policies around vehicle efficiency and fossil fuel reduction in the state fleet. Again, the previous EO 484 did not set vehicle specific requirements. So these are some really new and necessary directives as vehicles play a key piece of the broader decarbonization puzzle and an area where the LB portfolio in particular needs to make considerable progress, especially in the long term. I mean, in the near term and long term. And so to better support the overall fleet electrification targets, the order further prioritizes fleet decarbonization by establishing new zero-emission vehicle acquisition requirements, a host of procurement and fleet management policies, and EV charging infrastructure policies for state-owned facilities, which I'll get into now. And as Eric spoke to earlier when reviewing the 594 targets, at least 5% of the fleet must be zero emission by 2025, and 20% of the fleet must be zero emission by 2030. And if these targets seem modest, I think it's important to consider that zero emission vehicles, or ZEVs to just be short, currently comprise less than 1% of the roughly 6,500 lighter duty state fleet. So there's a considerable amount of work to be done. And as Eric noted earlier, the state fleet is a particularly hard nut to crack in terms of electrification. Roughly 70% of the fleet is comprised of trucks and vans, which do not yet have feasible ZEV alternatives, if any at all. Many state operations require specialized upfitting to meet unique and sometimes sensitive use cases. And the fleet has a slower turnover, that 8 to 12 year turnover, which means that annual vehicle replacements simply limit how fast the fleet can electrify. At the same time, the EO recognizes that we can't wait for all of those barriers to work themselves out entirely before we start actually purchasing ZEVs. And so the order couples the fleet percentage target with phased ZEV acquisition requirements. And these requirements will help to ensure that the transition to ZEVs is, 1, not delayed where replacements are possible now, and 2, not completely backloaded to the latter part of the decade when more ZEV models are available to meet that broader range of fleet needs and class sizes. Thus, starting in 2023, any acquisition, and that's purchase or lease, 8,500 pounds or less, must be ZEV. In 2025, any acquisition 14,000 pounds or less must be ZEV. And finally, in 2030, all acquisitions in the state fleet must be ZEV. So in addition to that, when acquiring ZEVs, the EO prioritizes technologies that do not rely on fossil fuels. So that's battery electric or fuel cell vehicles, for example, before considering a dual fuel technology like a plug-in hybrid. And the order also recognizes that ZEV models may not always be available to meet fleet needs or may be cost prohibitive from a total cost of ownership perspective. And in those cases, the order then requires acquisition of the most efficient model available to meet those fleet needs. So in short, prioritizing the cleanest, most fuel efficient models wherever available and feasible. Next slide. Obviously, targets and requirements only get us part of the way there. So the EO also prioritizes a focus on procurement and operational practices that address our fleets more holistically. The Operational Services Division, OSD, and the Green Fleet Committee, which is chaired by OSD and DOER in collaboration with Mass DEP and Executive Branch Fleets. The Green Fleet Committee will be developing fleet acquisition and management policies that support the goals of this order. These policies will outline procedures that help to reduce vehicle fossil fuel use to the greatest extent feasible and include, obviously, acquiring zero emission vehicles, but also acquiring vehicles that are sized appropriately for the intended use cases, or acquiring the most fuel efficient vehicle models that can meet an agency's needs, or sometimes looking to right size your fleet by not replacing a vehicle at all if not really needed. Procedures also include conducting fleet optimization evaluations that incorporate both vehicle utilization and total cost of ownership in order to identify vehicles for removal or replacement, and also reducing vehicle miles traveled and increasing efficient driving practices that help to increase fuel economy. So really trying to get at fleet efficiency and decarbonization from all angles. And lastly, the Green Fleet Committee will continue to oversee the fuel efficiency standard, the FES, as many of you likely know it as, which currently applies to the light duty executive branch fleet and sets MPG and alternative fuel vehicle acquisition requirements. And in light of the new vehicle targets and requirements in EO 594, the Green Fleet Committee will soon undertake a review of the FES and develop requirements that can better support the order's directives. Next slide. And of course, we need to be able to charge all these new ZEVs in the fleet and those visiting our facilities. Thus, the targets in this order will double the number of EV charging stations sited at state facilities. And that includes charging for public, workplace, and fleet needs, while also prioritizing EV charging infrastructure during new construction, both for station installation and EV-ready parking spots, like Katie noted earlier. So while we might not have loads of EVs right now, we do want to make sure that our facilities are prepared for that growth in vehicle electrification. Next slide. So moving on, Section 6 of the EO addresses renewable and clean energy resource directives, some pieces of which Katie touched on earlier as they relate to new and existing buildings. And as you may or may not have noticed, in this target section, EO 594 does not set hard targets for renewable generation as a percentage of overall electricity consumption, as the previous EO 484 did. This was driven by two primary considerations. The first is that in order to decarbonize as cost effectively as possible, investment should primarily be focused on technologies that provide considerably greater emissions benefits to support EO 594's fossil fuel reduction targets and requirements. Although still important, the installation of renewable assets like solar PV will begin to have diminishing returns on emissions reductions. And second, because the vast majority of state government renewable projects rely on the sale or decoupling of the renewable energy certificates associated with the electricity an asset produces, it would make it nearly impossible to meet specific targets while making transparent claims about the environmental attributes. That being said, renewable generation has been an area of significant progress for the LBE portfolio. We have over 24 megawatts of installed solar PV alone. These technologies play an important role at many of our facilities and will continue to offer considerable grid and demand benefits, especially as statewide electrification ramps up significantly. And so the new EO enforces the importance of deploying and procuring renewable and clean energy, and whether that's through on-site generation, purchasing agreements to support off-site resources, or local and clean electricity procurement, but also prioritizes innovative technology deployment, such as energy storage, all of which will help to reduce demand and increase the resilience of our facilities. And with that, I believe I am handing it off to Ryan.
All right, thanks, Kelsey. All right, so I'm going to talk about the final few sections of the executive order here, starting with some additional sustainability priorities. So the additional priorities section is divided into a few different categories that don't have specific targets, but will help reduce the environmental footprint and emissions of state facility operations. So the first here is related to demand management and energy storage. Basically says where possible, entities must incorporate demand management strategies into their facilities and participate in applicable programs that provide financial incentive for demand response. And where possible, as mentioned earlier, agencies should be pairing on-site renewables with storage. Relatedly, agencies will need to incorporate facility and energy resilience and adhere to the resiliency measures identified in Executive Order 569 and the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. In general, this is really intended to improve the capacity of our critical infrastructure to withstand the weather-related impacts of climate change. And under building energy monitoring, DCAM, in collaboration with the LB program, will continue to expand its energy metering and monitoring program, namely targeting buildings larger than 20,000 square feet. Those that aren't participating in these programs, though, will work to ensure that building energy performance is monitored and evaluated on a regular basis. On the sort of non-energy side, none of this should be too new or surprising, but agencies will continue to comply with Executive Order 515 and purchase environmentally preferable products and services, as well as complying with all current and future waste bans promulgated by Mass DEP, while also working to minimize the total amount of waste generated. Sustainable landscaping is new to the executive order, but one that our program has talked about before. The executive order tasks agencies with incorporating sustainable landscaping practices that include, but are not limited to, planting native plant species to support pollinators and native wildlife, reducing the use and toxicity of pesticides whenever possible and appropriate, and utilizing zero-emission landscaping equipment. And last but not least, the water conservation section tasks agencies with reducing water consumption wherever possible and following the best practices in the state's water conservation standards. So there is a lot in this executive order. So Section 8 directs the LB program in collaboration with DCAM and Mass CEC and others as necessary to develop guidance, guidelines, and studies to support the implementation of this order and to help achieve our targets. Documents include those listed here, but are not limited to this list. And that will cover research on various carbon policies that will help us reach the goals of this order, strategies to reduce non-carbon sources of greenhouse gas emissions, including refrigerants, identifying financing strategies to achieve the goal of the order, developing recommendations on developing agency-specific clean energy and low-carbon roadmap that can be used by other agencies to achieve long-term decarbonization goals. And we might develop guides that can recommend ways that agencies can facilitate the adoption of innovative technologies and strategies, namely by addressing administrative and regulatory barriers. Finally, we arrive at Section 9, which focuses on program administration. So this reestablishes the LB Council and membership, which we'll get back to in a second. It also requires all agencies with more than 75 employees to appoint a leading by example coordinator to collaborate with LB staff, and that coordinator will work with us to comply with the reporting requirements, establish internal agency working groups as needed, and work with their own facilities to support the targets and programs within the order as needed. Our program will, as usual, continue to develop tools and trainings to support this work, and we'll work on energy tracking and reporting as we have always done. And finally, agencies, when they are developing strategies to improve energy efficiency, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, construct zero net energy buildings, or install clean energy, they are asked to consider opportunities to use innovative technologies. And we'll be working with Mass CEC and again other entities to create the guidance needed to help identify future opportunities to support this effort. All right, so now that you all know everything about the executive order, we wanted to spend a second on what comes next. So what are agency responsibilities right now? Well, we're going to have a deeper dive discussion on this at a future webinar, but some quick highlights are noted here. So as mentioned, the data tracking and reporting will continue, and you'll receive further guidance on this down the line, as will participation in the Leading by Example Council. Agencies will need to identify LB coordinators. That will be many of those that already work with our program. And agencies will also need to work to start thinking about ways to advance innovative technologies and approaches to help advance the goals of the order. The most notable thing, though, is this line from Section 4, which is that all agencies should incorporate the goals of this order into equipment replacement schedules and capital and master plans. Recognize that we aren't going to reach the goals of this order overnight, but we do need to start taking action now to achieve these goals. Some of these actions will be more immediate than others, such as the requirement to buy B10 biofuel, as Katie mentioned, that starts July 1st. as well as looking at electric vehicles and zero-emission vehicles when you're ready to procure a new vehicle. We'll have more guidance and discussions on this, which I'll get to in a second when we go over upcoming webinars. Right, so coming soon, DOER Commissioner Woodcock will be sending letters to the leadership of agencies and public institutions of higher education. This letter is intended to remind all agencies with more than 75 employees of this order and confirm LB coordinators and key contacts. Smaller agencies, authorities, and more independent entities will be invited to participate in these efforts. They'll also be invited to identify LB coordinators and participate in the council. As I passed over earlier, the executive order does list specific agencies listed here that are required to participate in the executive order, but other entities will be invited to participate at future meetings as well. 13 is going to be working on a series of guidelines that will further define the terms of significance and guidance for implementation in the coming months. Guides will cover everything from the new construction standards and guidelines for existing buildings, all the way down to EV charging and fleet efficiency, renewables, and other sustainability initiatives. If there are other particular topics that you'd like more guidance on or specific questions you have over the coming weeks, we ask you to please reach out and we will try to address them in these upcoming webinars or in future guidance documents. There will also be opportunities to comment on these guidance as we develop them as well. All right, so speaking of opportunities to learn more, we hope you can join us at some of our future webinars. We are currently at the May 13th mark here. But at our next webinar on May 26th, we will have a discussion on the executive order targets and what we can do to achieve those targets and what resources we can provide to help you out. The next two will be focused on buildings and vehicle targets. And the last will again be more discussion based, focused on the roles and responsibilities of state and entities to implement this order. So I think that just about covers our formal presentation here. So I'm going to stop recording and I will then ask you all to raise your hands or address any questions in the comment box.